Okay, so they're going around. Let's see what they do here. I'm trying to figure out why he has his hand up there.
He's got his phone playing music or something.
Oh,
yeah.
So that
it's like instead of a boombox. Remember the boombox? Now he's got his phone.
That's awesome. So this is your outdoor stomping grounds?
Yeah, I mean, I don't bring people here that much because I never know how crowded it's going to be. I kind of come more myself just to do something remotely athletic outside of a gym.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it would be cool to, if while you're here we can get some people, because I don't really know any other place to do it. I mean, you've been to Solace, so there's not a lot of room to open it up there.
Yeah, I noticed when I walked down, when you were meeting with the NBA team down by the Trade Center, there was like a field there too.
Yes.
And that's like a soccer field for just same sort of thing?
Same thing, but not nearly as big as this. So.
Okay.
I mean, here, no matter how many people are playing, there's always some kind of a lane you can find to run. Whereas I think some of those other fields are like 50 meters.
Okay,
at the
so
longest.
it's kind of a condensed.
If like if there's one game going on, then you really can't do anything.
Okay.
And there's a lot of sideline room here. So yeah, this is amazing though. I don't know why it's this empty, but.
That's nice.
Yeah.
It's a nice view too.
Yep.
I mean, that's pretty cool.
They have a little, somewhere up here, they have like a trapeze class. I think it's over there actually. So,
up there?
Yeah, so maybe like around 6, you'll see the after work crowd. And maybe they don't do it anymore because it's getting too cold, but yeah, they have like adult trapeze classes over there. Yeah. Something for everybody here in New York. Yeah.
More clients for you.
Yeah.
So when you met with the NBA team, I was lucky enough to be invited to that. What was the intent?
If you want to call luck the word, yeah.
What was the intent? Like, did they say, we want you to, do this type of presentation on this topic, or did they kind of leave it open to you?
Yeah, you know what, I think with, as you know in sports, it's kind of like if other people are doing something, then teams want to do what everybody else is doing. So they didn't have a particular objective. It was more, they'd heard about some of the other work that we were doing, and they said, hey, we're going to be in town. Would you mind doing for us what you've done with some of these other organizations? So that was kind of the impetus for it. But prior to them actually arriving, we gave them an itinerary of what we were going to talk about, just to make sure that it's what they wanted, and they seemed okay with it. So yeah, that was kind of how it originated.
But there wasn't anything specific, like it was a more injury prevention, injury management?
Yeah, I mean, our whole thing, I think, that we try to make very clear is that we don't have a specific, like one thing that we focus on. It's more of a global approach. So we would look at something like injury risk mitigation and performance training and ACL rehab. It's kind of all the same thing, because if it's a pro sports environment, kind of the end stage is what's going to be done in the field. So whether someone's coming off an ACL injury or someone's presumably healthy in the off season, they still need to get to a place where they're prepared for the game. And the only thing that really would change would be maybe earlier on in an acute injury scenario, you're doing more like passive range of motion, and you can't load the injured tissue as much, but you can still load the other joints, albeit safely. So it's really more of a continuum, and that's kind of, I think the most organizations that contact us know that's our approach. So it's kind of like the anti-specialist, because I think that there's certainly a place for specialization when it comes to things like surgery. If you had a knee surgery, you'd want to go to the guy that only does knee surgeries. But I think for what you and I do, it's a little bit different. And even if we're PTs or physios, if we said, well, we're going to do physio things, but we didn't even appreciate things like sprint preparation or some of the things that maybe you're more known for, even though you have a global approach as well. I mean, it's very hard to get all these specialists together in a way that they're going to communicate seamlessly and then create kind of a unified product. So we're trying to learn as much as we can about all the components that are relevant to performance. And then if there's something that's really, really specialized, like if it's somebody who wants to actually like participate in track and field at a very high level, like Olympic trials, then we'll send them to a sprint coach who's more knowledgeable. But I think for a team sport athlete, a lot of the boundaries between the professions are very arbitrary, and because, especially in the con ed market, everybody wants to make what they do so unique, because that's how you market yourself. People just kind of kick the can from one specialist to another, and no one is trying to unify those different pieces of information. It's just the whole like reductionism and specialization versus a global approach, and I think that the pendulum has maybe swung too far towards the specialization side of things and not as much towards the global side of things.
If I were to kind of force you to say, like, what are you really good at, and what would set you apart, if from a marketing approach, what would you say to people? How would you bring that forward to a team or an organization?
I mean, I think probably a bullshit filter. So, no, I'm serious. Because I've been fortunate enough to have had a variety of different professional and life experiences, starting with the military, which, people want to talk about like high performance, if you even use that term. I think that the special operations community is a high performance environment, and so they're trying to solve the same questions as pro sports teams. And I think that there are even problems with the way that data was tracked in the military, and even just having too much of a specialized approach and not enough communication among the different disciplines. And that's always the biggest debrief item in a lot of missions is like, communication needs to be better. So same thing you see in sports. And then, so kind of just having that filter. And then I would say that, I am trained as a PT, so maybe having a little bit more appreciation for joint function and quality of movement. So if performance is about loading joints, and then adding, things like fatigue and unpredictability through games and competition. But if you don't appreciate joint function, I don't know how you would load joints and then put them in these more dynamic environments. So it's kind of like really knowing what good is supposed to look like. It's, from a movement standpoint, kind of like where you can watch somebody sprint and it's that instinct that you and Charlie always talk about. It's like, okay, it looks right, flies right. I think that we don't like the subjective element of performance anymore. We want to measure things. I think that's certainly a need, and we should try to quantify objectively what our eyes tell us. But I think taking some of these, like biomechanical concepts at the lowest level from like an acute scenario, but then saying, okay, when you're going to load these joints, whether it's in the weight room or on the field, how do you maintain that quality? Because there's this whole like corrective exercise market. Do you want to walk around again, or do you want to go back outside?
Let's see what else there is.
Yeah. So there's this whole like corrective exercise market, and the idea is that you somehow need these special corrective exercises to undo the damage that's created by everything else that you do. But I would argue that if you don't emphasize the execution in everything that you do, then like no amount of corrective training or whatever you want to call it is going to make up for example, if you're squatting under load with a lot of weight and you don't have the same sort of standard for movement quality and execution as you would for doing a band walk with a band around your ankles and walking laterally, no amount of band walks is going to resonate from an adaptation standpoint as much as doing the squat with poor form. So, and that was a huge thing even in the military, was everything was about position, and people like to say that there's no optimal way to move, which is true. If we're speaking in the abstract, there's no optimal, but there's different degrees of good and bad. So when you're jumping out of an airplane in the military, there's a body position that's more conducive to flying in a stable manner. When you're shooting, there's a position that allows you to shoot on the move and keep your grouping more accurate. When you're doing a medical intervention, like you're giving someone an airway, when you're visualizing the airway with a laryngoscope, there's a position that allows you to maximize that visual field. So position is key in every sport, and even outside of sports. So I would say like what differentiates us is just we emphasize the position and the execution aspect of things, regardless of whether we're going really fast or really slow. I just think it's technique is the key, and if you're using like language as a metaphor, maybe just like grammar, right? So anyone can write a book or a poem, but there's certain rules that allow you to structure all that variability in a way that kind of makes sense. And I think when it comes to performance, a lot of times people don't really respect grammar as much as they should, and they just want to, add more horsepower to the car or make people go faster without really having the frame for it. So just regardless of what people do, focusing on the execution piece. And if you do that, then you don't need to do as much ancillary work in the form of corrective training or whatever. I think the basics done really well, and there's endless variations of those basics, I think will yield the most return on investment from a performance standpoint, more so than having a very specialized and piecemeal approach.
Yeah, because I know with my own issues, I'll say that I've had some issues with it, my hip and back, and when I run, fine. If I lift heavy or do something explosive, fine. But the little things really mess me up. So walking and little tasks like, cleaning up leaves in the garden. And so when I saw you, I thought, well, what's wrong? Like, I can do all these great things like explosive, but I must, I didn't know I was deficient. I just thought maybe I'm tight, maybe I have some pathology. And then you started putting me through some assessments, which I did okay. But when you put me into some exercises, it felt like this is the toughest thing I've done for a long time. And what did you get from that in terms of my situation?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that surprising, because for the most part, like, all I'm really trying to do is find the low-hanging fruit from a movement standpoint. So if we go back to the language analogy, you've got to have an alphabet to perform a complex task. So if you take letters away from the alphabet, then it's much harder to communicate. And you have to have grammar. You have to have a way to organize that variability. Otherwise, if I said, okay, there's 26 letters in the English language, there's no rules, people wouldn't be able to communicate. Everybody would come up with their own set of rules. And then from there, then you're trying to write, sentences and paragraphs. So if you're sprinting well, effectively, you can write the sentences and paragraphs, no problem. But I just tried to find, okay, I start with the alphabet, just basic joint range of motion and function, and you were actually, for the most part, pretty good there. I mean, nothing too glaring outside of just missing a little bit of hip internal rotation on both sides. But then taking those joints and just in a very low threatening environment, having you do just basic, more isometric type activities, some different side plank variations and bridge variations, where I didn't allow you to go fast, and I forced you to kind of work under a little bit more control. You didn't do as well there. So it's not that there's anything that's dysfunctional about you per se. It's just that I think you always, it's kind of like going back to the military. I mean, if from a tactical standpoint, the ultimate in terms of a mission is doing close quarter battle, where you're going in as a team into a building at night and clearing rooms with an opposition force. That doesn't mean that just because you can do that well, you still wouldn't want to go back to the shooting range and work on your position and the fundamentals of shooting when there's no opponent there. So just even shooting at a paper target and working on stance and trigger control. So in your case, even though you can sprint well, and that's the equivalent of maybe doing doing close quarter battle, if you don't spend enough time maintaining the basic alphabet and grammar and the components that contribute to sprinting, then it's just, I think you have less of a base. So I think that effectively, what a PT does really is just, they make you less of a specialist from a movement standpoint. So you were very specialized to sprint well, and when you can maintain really good positions when your joints are moving fast, but when we kind of slowed you down a little bit, you had more trouble. And so the idea is not that if you do the things that we worked on, it's going to make you faster per se. I think it just might allow you to express yourself in such a way that when you are sprinting, maybe the cost of sprinting isn't as high because you've got more variability and more grammar from which to organize your movement. So it's not that you really had any pathology, and physios don't fix pathology. Only a surgeon can do that. So even a lot of times you go to a physio and they say, they want to have one diagnosis where it's well, this is the tissue that's implicated or the structure. And if it truly was one thing, then you'd be in the wrong office. You should be going to an orthopedist who can repair that structure. So I try not to make claims that I can't back up. I don't know why really your hip hurts, but if you have an objective process that allows you to find kind of the low-hanging fruit, whether it's from the alphabet standpoint, the grammatical standpoint, or even when you're kind of writing and putting the whole thing together, just figure out what are reasonable things that an athlete should have, And you need to address all those components at all points. So we didn't even get into the sprinting piece, but I mean, you said that you feel fine when you do that, and that's an area where you're certainly more knowledgeable than myself. So it just seemed like for you, the low-hanging fruit was from some of the lower level motor control drills, especially at slower speeds. And I mean,
so was that bicycle analogy a good analogy? Like, I can ride a bicycle and have no problem, but when I have to like go at slow speed or I have to stand on the bicycle and balance, I'm messed up, like I can't do it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's just, you know, people adapt to whatever tasks they repeatedly expose themselves to, and if you're very specialized to go fast, you never asked yourself repeatedly over time to hold some of the positions that we worked on, but it's much easier to default to some more like reflexive type patterns when you're sprinting, because when you're sprinting, it's really a hindbrain activity. Yeah. Granted, you can improve sprinting technique through drills that are a little bit more conscious, but once the gun goes off and you're competing, I mean, you know, you're not really thinking about some of the motor control things that we emphasized yesterday. So it's just giving you a little bit more variability, so that even in a high threat environment, like when you're sprinting or you're playing a game with opponents, at least the nervous system will have options from which to choose, because we can give you more variability in a table. It doesn't mean that when you sprint, you're going to want to use that variability. It just means that at least now your brain has a choice. And so I think that that's kind of ultimately all that a physio really does, is they just give you choices, and under stress and competition, you might still choose to default to a pattern that, you know, somebody might say is dysfunctional or not optimal, but at least when you're not doing that high threat activity, then you can do other things. So then when you're not competing, you know, you're not constantly overusing the same tissues or defaulting to the same patterns. So basically, yes, when you're competing, you want to be kind of a specialist. You want to perform, you want to minimize degrees of freedom. So it's kind of like the aviator during an in-flight emergency. That's why they have a checklist, because you want to minimize your options when there's a true emergency.
When you have to land in here, right?
Exactly. So this is actually pretty close to where I think Sully, the same river that Sully had to land in, but you don't want to have to make up a new procedure on the fly in a high threat environment. But at least when you're not in that high threat environment, that's the time where you want to have more options, so that you're not constantly using maybe like a higher threat type of pattern in a lower threat environment, which is what I often see with people who compete in sprinting sports or even strength sports, where like it's almost like their body thinks that they're performing even when they're not, and they only know how to use like a really, you know, a high speed or a high threshold, high tension type of strategy when they're walking along a river. So you shouldn't have to be in performance mode just to, you know, to walk along a path here, but when people become too specialized, that's effectively what happens.
I will say though that the last 2 days I've had numbness in my foot, pain in my glute, some stiffness in low back hip flexor, and we're walking now. I'm fine. Just because of a couple of exercises you gave me, and I did them this morning, and
which is rare that people actually do them, but thank you. Yeah.
No, I'm like, I'm gonna do this.
Yeah.
And I did it, and I was a little sleep deprived, but I still did it. And yeah, I might feel a slight sensation like it's just a little off, but yeah, 100 times better. And it blows my mind that I could just activate a couple of muscle groups with not a lot of volume either, and it corrected it.
Right.
What's going on?
Well, that shows, number one, there was nothing really wrong with you per se. So I think that, but that's good news, because I think that medicine and medical providers tend to over-pathologize things to create dependency, because it's like the more screwed up people are, then the better it is for business.
Sure.
But in your case, I mean, assuming that it worked as well as you say, it's just a matter of giving you what you need. So there's often the talk in our field where it's like, well, what if you give somebody something, if you make somebody do something that they're not good at, is that going to screw them up when they have to perform? Yeah. And like literally, like I had you do like basically a bent knee side plank with a little bit of glute activation, and it was really challenging for you. So I don't think that doing like a bent knee side plank is going to screw you up when you run. I would argue that at one point you were running a sub 1100, correct?
Yeah, about
Yeah.
11 flat. Like
Yeah.
that's.
So I would argue that someone who can run like an 11 flat 100 should be able to hold a side plank for like 20 seconds without falling apart. So I think that, you know, again, it's just giving you more options so that when you do have to perform, at least there's a choice to be had. But then when you're not performing, you have other patterns you can utilize besides the one that you use when you sprint. So I think it just gives you enough. A lot of it's about like eliminating threat, right? So if your brain thinks that you only have one strategy to do something, then you're not that adaptable outside of the environment that you're specialized to perform in. So I think just introducing you to a little bit of variability, and again, like if you truly had a tissue problem and that your pain was generated by tissue pathology, you wouldn't feel any better that quickly. So it's obviously some kind of a neurological phenomenon where maybe if you reduce the threat, i.e. kind of trick somebody into thinking that they're sort of safe and they have other ways to control themselves, then maybe that's how it works. But I don't think that it works because like we quote unquote fix something. I just think if it works because we gave you some more options, and we just, you know, it's kind of like if pain is a smoke alarm in your body, you want the smoke alarm to go off when your house is on fire, not when you're boiling water on the stove.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, especially with chronic pain, like with what you've had, there's a disconnect between the actual threat to the body and the perceived threat.
Yeah.
And so the more you can basically desensitize people to some movements that would normally be painful. So like you hear about like flexion intolerant backs, and people will say, well, you should avoid flexion. Well, if someone has a flexion intolerant back, I want them to actually tolerate flexion. Otherwise, we didn't make them better. So how do you desensitize someone to flexion? Maybe you're not going to have them, you know, touch their hands to the floor if that hurts, but maybe, you know, 4 inches from the floor isn't painful. So you work in that range. You do some drills where you learn how to control the body in that range, and you gradually increase the range until now you've kind of reset the threshold for that smoke alarm, and what was once threatening isn't. So it's not to minimize the role of tissue pathology, because that can certainly influence things, but if that was the driver for you, then you wouldn't have made that quick a change. So, and when it comes to tissue adaptation, the best way to do that, provided you don't need surgery, is just to train. And then consistently over time, you'll develop those adaptations. But like that's where physio I don't think physio appreciates the role of adaptation enough. They rely on like these very short-term interventions, and like that's what we did with you. But if we don't continue to load you and then progress you in a way that where the context kind of equilibrates more with what you actually want to do, which is sprinting, we have to bridge that gap between the lower threat environment and the game. So like what we did yesterday would just kind of be step one, and then the idea is to be able to maybe incorporate some of those patterns into a higher threat environment. So now you really own them. But a lot of times just introducing somebody to something novel, and I think that's the power of it. It's more the novelty. But if you force people to adapt and do the things that they don't want to do, a lot of times the body will thank you for it, and in the form of decreased pain or whatever effect you felt from yesterday.
Okay, we'll take a short break. This is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Wow, this is a nice walk, man.
Yeah.
Do you have people run here, or do you run along here, or do anything along this path, or?
Sometimes I do more of the running on the turf over there if I do.
Okay.
But
it's more forgiving.
Yeah, this is more walking around, you know, especially on a night like this. I mean, I'm actually surprised that it's not way more crowded, because it's warmer than it should be this time of year. So.
This is cool.
Yeah.
So we're talking about my particular issues and giving me more variability, giving me some options to kind of work on things that I might be a little weaker in. So when you work with a team, or you're called in to work with a team, is that essentially what you're talking to them about, is giving them some options, giving them some variability for their athletes in areas they may have gaps?
It could be. I mean, I think the first thing, if you're consulting with a team, is trying to figure out like what their gaps are. So I think that there are certain things from a variability standpoint that team sport athletes should have. So like if you're a multi-directional athlete and you have no hip rotation, right? I don't think giving you more is going to make you worse. So finding the low-hanging fruit as far as that goes. If you're missing hip extension and you have to run, that can be problematic. But you know, if that's all you do, then that's a very like physiocentric way of looking at performance. So and then the next thing is, okay, well, how do you utilize that variability in a way that has more context to the performance environment? So that's where, like with some of the organizations that we're talking about, like I'll go over sprint progressions and even conditioning progressions, because rehab people tend to not think about that, so they focus more on, okay, like how do we get the joint range of motion back to where it's supposed to be? And as long as the joint's functioning presumably well on the table, they kind of treat the goniometer, right?
Yeah.
And there's no goniometer Olympics. Like you don't get a gold medal, or you don't get contracts because you make the goniometer, you get the best reading on the goniometer. So for there, it's okay. Like how do we, once we restore that variability, how do we load the joints and actually prepare them for competition? So it's just working backwards. I mean, it's going back to the military. Like if you have to parachute out of an airplane at night with equipment, well, certainly if you've never done it before, you've got to start out by learning the body position, whether it's like on a table or even in a wind tunnel. And then once you do that, then you start out by doing jumps with an instructor next to you with no equipment. And then once you do that, you might do a non-equipment jump at night, and then you'll add an equipment jump during the day. So it's systematically just progressing people. But in sports, people, they usually have to run and change direction. And as I'm not, I think that we tend to over quantify and measure things, but I think when it comes to the game, there are decent ways to objectively assess what's happening. So if we know that a midfielder in lacrosse has to run this amount in a game, in certain speed ranges and change direction, we need to prepare somebody as best we can for those loads. And so if you're not doing any change of direction work that's mimicking what's going on in the field in terms of the intensity and the duration or the total volume, then it doesn't matter how well somebody tests on the table. So now, like you're a big proponent of doing maximal velocity sprinting for field sport athletes who may often not get to top speed.
Yep.
And the idea with that is you're giving people a physiological buffer so that even at sub-maximal velocities, maybe those velocities aren't as threatening, because the more you can raise your ceiling, then even if you're running at 90% or whatever, your 90% is still faster than someone else's 100%.
Yes.
And it's from like a threat standpoint, if you're used to running at higher intensities, then the stresses that you encounter in the game, now maybe you're less likely to have a hamstring injury or some kind of a tendon injury, because you can't separate the neurological aspect from the histological aspect. It's all kind of the same thing. So giving people that physiological buffer, but there's no way to do that unless you expose people to risk. So I think that it can be almost too much risk aversion in rehab, because if you're a rehab person, you could always say, well, I'm going to get them moving well on the table, but it's not really my job to expose them to risk. It's not my job to get them to sprint or to change direction. That's the strength coach's job or the sport coach's job. And if you have that, but if everybody has that attitude, then no one's actually having the athlete do the work that he or she needs to do to be prepared. So then these athletes show up at training camp and they haven't done any sprinting. They haven't accumulated enough work. There's the whole acute to chronic thing, and people can argue about like, well, what algorithms are best, and what's the point at which you don't want to do too much acute training relative to what you've been doing. And that's the minutia. But the idea is, if you've been doing like no sprinting at all or no running, so there's even coaches who say like, well, the weight room can prepare people for running. Like, no, it can't. Yeah. I mean, everybody talks about specificity, and people for the most part respect that law of training. So I don't know how you can respect that law of training and then say that the weight room is going to prepare people for running. Yeah. So it's almost like a lot of what we do is just stating the obvious. Like, if people have to run, get them to run, and get them to run at the speed and the volumes that are required for the game, albeit in a way that the execution is emphasized, because I think that we do have an obligation to, if we do see some mechanical disparities relative to what we think is good, especially in a rehab environment where you have a lot of time with somebody, why not earlier on, when you can't load them that much, have them work on technique, and then build on that technique later on at the speed and the volumes that are required for the sport. So it's really just, it's not just consulting with the team and saying, okay, like, here's the one thing you guys are missing. It's looking at the whole process and figuring out, like, are you addressing all the components of the process albeit in different proportions throughout the rehabilitation, because even post-op ACL, there's ways to, and I'm talking immediately post-op, there's ways to maintain a high chronic training load, with the upper body. There's ways to somewhat simulate the energetic demands of the sport, maybe not with the lower body, but there's things you can do if you're creative. And a lot of times, like, medical people focus on what people can't do, but it still gives you a lot of options. I mean, a surgery might provide more constraints earlier on in the preparation process, but beyond that, there's so many things that you can do. So people can still train power and capacity in the upper body coming off a lower body surgery, or vice versa. So maybe the focus, post-op for the surgical site is just focusing on the alphabet and the grammar a little bit, but then you could still write stories with the non-surgical sites and write poetry or whatever, as long as you do it safely and responsibly. So just looking at, it's really more about having a process and a way to audit every component of the program, and not just say like, okay, well, this is what rehab has to do and strength and conditioning should do. And not everybody has to know everybody else's job, but I think that if all you know is what your job is supposed to be, then you better respect the other members of the team who provide a skill set that, even in a day one post-op environment, I think that the people who are more performance-minded can play a huge role there, because tissues have to heal, and there's a timeline upon which they heal. So you could argue that outside of like passive range of motion, immediately post-op, there's not a whole lot you can do besides wait. So the only real training you're doing is in the non-surgical site. So I think a lot of times, like, just the best rehab you can do is to kind of worry about everything else, because the thing that you're effectively worried about surgically is like, it's going to take time to heal no matter what, and then you've got to load it. So it's like, going back to what we said earlier, it's never one thing, and I think that's the problem with the field, is it's getting more and more specialized, that we always focus on, okay, what's the one thing we're missing, and it's never, I think that's the wrong question, I guess. So long-winded way of saying we have to ask the right questions.
But like, when we're in that room with that team, you feel comfortable addressing both sides of that, the performance side, the rehab, injury prevention side, and speaking to both and kind of jumping in and out of, and which you're not, you're kind of just being yourself, but yeah, you're kind of addressing both of those and having confidence. And I honestly think having that military background helps too, because a lot of people will defer to, this is what the military does, and they're very tough on people, and there's a lot of discipline. So you can speak from that point of view as well. And I think it's a really interesting position to be in, to have wearing all of these different kind of coats.
Yeah, and we always assume that the environments that we're not familiar with are maybe more competent than they are. So I think it's wrong to assume that there are things the military does really well, but there are things the military doesn't do well at all. Same thing in pro sports. So it's the opposite in the military, where the military looks to pro sports and is like, wow, like we need to do physical preparation like pro sports teams do it. Yeah. But I don't know if that's necessarily the right thing either. So I mean, the one thing that the military forces you to operate in some pretty unforgiving environments where there's not a lot of false confidence. Like, going in, I'm prepared for this, and I'm not. And because of the feedback you get if you're not prepared, things, at least at the unit level, change very quickly. And so, I don't talk about things that I'm not knowledgeable about. So if I don't know something, I'm totally comfortable telling a team, like, I don't know the answer to that, but here's where to find it. But yeah, the differentiation between the rehab and performance, it's more politically and financially driven, because if you're a PT, you don't really want strength coaches to understand joint function. That's my job. You guys stick to just loading the joints, but you can't load a joint without understanding joint function. So what you're asking for is unreasonable. And the flip side of that is, if you're a strength coach and you're saying, well, you're a PT, it's not your job to worry about loading the joint. Well, okay, so how are you preparing a joint for, the end goal if you're not loading it? Like, you're just gonna do manual therapy and rub it and ultrasound it and stim it. So I think a lot of the distinctions that people make are more self-serving, and it's just to create more of a niche for their profession. And And if you know the military gives me a sense of credibility, I guess I'm okay with that. But I would implore people to question even my experiences there, and don't assume it just because I worked in one environment that it makes me knowledgeable about like what a pro sports team should do. I mean, if the military background maybe opens up people's ears, I still should have to say something that resonates. And I'm definitely open to criticism, and I want people to question what I do. And the incident that you're alluding to, like the people were very inquisitive, and at some points very critical, and like that's the way it should be. I should have to justify what I do, even if it's novel and might seemingly contradict what a team is doing. Like these are the conversations that drive all of our professions forward. And I think that we're kind of at a point now, politically especially, where like people don't want to have difficult conversations. As soon as something gets remotely controversial, it's you call someone a name, and then you go hide under a rock with your tribe, and everybody hides under their rocks and kind of yells at each other from behind their rock. And like the only way to really advance these discussions is to try to collaborate and then figure out what boundaries are reasonable between all these specialized bodies of knowledge. So I think these contentious conversations are really good as long as people don't take them too personally.
Yeah, well, this has been great because I'm in your neighborhood. Well, last time we talked was over Skype, but now I'm kind of immersed in what you deal with on a daily basis, and it's pretty cool just to be able to walk and talk with you, and definitely be doing more of this with you.
Yeah, no, it's fun.
So, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.